Would you give a warm welcome for His Honour Christopher Compston? You say three things. One of which you say, you're talking about the purpose of prison. And one of the things you say is, the first thing, the purpose of prison is to punish people. It's also to protect the public. And on the third part, you say the third part is something we fail on and we don't do very well, and it's about rehabilitation. What do you mean when you say that?
Well, by rehabilitation, what I mean is this, is reintegrating people back into society. If you can, reconnecting them with their family and their children and their parents, because many criminals are very young. I mean, they've got parents and grandparents who are only in their 40s and 60s. Just getting them back into society. And I don't think we do that at all well in the courts.
What would you, following on for that, what could we do better about the rehabilitation side of it? So you've had men and women standing in front of you as a judge. You've sentenced them to prison and various other things. What could we do better about rehabilitation? What don't we do?
Well, I think we could do many things better, frankly. One is, and please, I'm not knocking the probation service. I think that they're...
Watch the mic. Can you just pull it? That's it. A bit.
I'm not knocking the probation service. I think they're overworked and they're underpaid. But, and it's a very important but I can't stress enough and I'm not being patronizing, I can't stress enough the inadequacy of so many people who come into the courts. And I always had a dream that one could publish the pre-sentence reports, i.e. the probation reports, with the names, of course, suitably altered. Because if the general public saw the problems which so many of these people face, they would almost not believe it. It's like a bad novel times 100. In other words, you know, Dad isn't there, or if Dad is there, he's an alcoholic or a drunkard, etc., etc. Mum finds somebody else, and you can hardly blame her because she's got to eat and she's lonely and miserable. And then, redundancy and violence, etc., etc., etc. And some of them can't read or write. I mean, the difficulties these people face are legendary. Now, of course, you're entitled to say, well, look, there are three brothers. Why are two respectable? Why is the third a criminal? Which, of course, does happen. But the fact is this, they need help. And they really don't get it. And you have a probation officer who's got far too much on his and her plate. And my dream is you would have in place a mentor. And early on, as early as possible, my wife Karen in the front will confirm, I can't bear waste. And there's so many people who are retired, who are perfectly fit. I mean, grief, to my amazement, I'm 78. I don't feel dead.
That's very reassuring, Christopher, thank you.
And I look around our village in Oxfordshire, and there are people, good people. I'm a committed Christian. They don't have to be committed Christians, but I think of a lovely chap called Ted, who is a Christian, as it happens. He's had 3 children, one died. I've lost 2 of my sons have died. But he's just super, and his wife is super. And what I'm dreaming of are people who would be connected to people in prison fairly early on. So if you're in for 3 years, the last year, the mentor would know them and befriend them. And the economics of it, I think, would be very easy. If it costs roughly 40,000 to keep a person in prison, well, if you can release them 3 months, 6 months later, it doesn't take much to show that you're saving 10 or 20,000 pounds, which obviously the Treasury would be quite glad on. And I remember Jonathan Aitken, and I've known him for years, saying you leave with a black bag and about 40 quid and no one to meet you. Well, that's disgraceful. So I think the mentor system, and I would give the mentor expenses, and if need be, some money, not necessarily paying him or her, but he would be there. I don't want to rabbit on too much, but when I think of the advantages which most of us have in this room, I mean, Caroline's, her parents lived to be 92, 97, and they kept their marbles until they were well in their 80s. My goodness me, I may have been a judge, so what? We would go to father-in-law who would sit smoking a pipe very quietly, and then the next day he'd say, my dears, I've been thinking about that problem, and give advice. He was 85, but absolutely on the ball. We have still have 4 children and 4.5 grandchildren. Well, we're in constant contact with them. They're terribly spoilt. Our daughter rings us, frankly, sometimes too much, I think. Because I want to have supper, and Caroline is being on the whole pretty wise on the telephone. But the point is this, we've got people to whom we can turn, and these people don't. And I think this is a tragedy.
So most of us haven't stood before a judge or a magistrate. I have, and that didn't end well. Ended a year in prison. But when you're on help us out here. So when you're sitting on the bench, and someone comes before you who have got that background, you're a committed Christian man. I know that. So you hear these pre-sentence reports. You see the difficulty. That this, like we said, there's no excuses for crime, but there's reasons. And you see this man or woman stood before you, it's mostly going to be men probably. How do you go about sentencing and being sort of carrying justice, which you are a judge, but judging that as well and doing something? Your first 2 points were to punish and to protect. How do you do that as a judge when this person is stood before you?
Well, it's a very tricky balancing act. There is no doubt about it. And when I say enemies, I don't quite mean this, but I mean the Court of Appeal is one challenge, and the local newspapers are certainly another challenge. So what I used to do was I would think what the sentence should, as it were, officially be. And I would always say, well, stand up, Joe Buggins. There's no question this is a disgraceful offence, and you should go to prison for 3 years. Understand that. Now that would shut the Court of Appeal up, and they need shutting up quite often, and to some extent would shut the local newspaper up. In other words, I did actually know what was right. Then I would turn to the defendant and say, on the other hand, you are only 18, you've had, and I can't give the details, a lousy start in life, a terribly difficult start in life. I've heard your uncle who says he's got you a job, etc., etc. And therefore, well, you shall go to prison for 2 years, not 3, and I will suspend it. And if I'm wrong, so what? If I'm wrong, you will commit other offences and you'll go down for 4 years, not from me. So I make it very simplistic. That's what I would try and do. But take, for example, rape, if the sentence has to be sort of, let's say, quickly, 5 or 6 years, well, then I would pass it. There were some offences so bad that, you couldn't, other than follow the proper tariff. But if one could just escape the proper tariff and give the person some light at the end of the tunnel, I would do it. I'd then be teased at lunch. I remember well in London, a very young new judge saying, what should I do in this case? And I looked up and said, well, double my sentence and halve his. And there was a burst of laughter, and the other judges said, actually, that's about right.
Goodness me. What are the... Christopher, tell us what you think, what's some other ways of sentencing? If we could, we've had a blank sheet and we could rewrite the sentencing part of the criminal justice system. What other ways are there out there that we could possibly have that balance between mercy and justice? What other ways would you say there are?
Well, as you know, Micah 6:8, act justly, love mercy, and be humble. Judge is not very good on the last one, I can tell you. Most. Well, there are. If you were mentoring, you see, you wouldn't have people in prison, or so many people in prison, because they wouldn't, I hope, go back. I think what I would do, which is not quite answering your question, but then no politicians always do answer the question they're asked.
Very rarely answer my questions, Christopher, it's fine.
Yes. I think what I would do, if I could, is I would use the services of recently retired judges. I would say to all the prison governors of the relevant prisons, look, we have got to get 20% of these people out now. And I myself would not have a solemn court, I'd have a quick tribunal. I'd have experienced, very experienced judges, not me, I'm now too old, but having experienced judges who would read the file, see the prisoner, and would give him this release. And therefore, I think if you had less people in prison, you could rehabilitate them with so much more ease. You can't if you have 3 people in a cell, which should take 1 and possibly take 2. You can't do it. So I do that. And as I say, there are things like community service, but it's not really very good. But again, if you can use the army of the fit, retired to monitor, not mentor, but monitor the community service, it would, I think, be of some assistance,
And Christopher, just to finish off, really, you sat on a bench for a long time. Goodness, you must have seen so many cases, so many families and distraught people coming before you. Could you share with us maybe one high and one low as sitting on a bench as a judge when you've had to do something?
Well, I think the low, and I think all of us in this room would agree, the low, I think, is realizing that actually that as a judge you can do comparatively little, certainly at the moment. But I think as a high, there are occasional times when things really do work. I remember this was a rather inadequate, rather a puny chap who had got a girlfriend. He was terribly thrilled. And then one day he went home and he found that this girlfriend was having it off with somebody else. And he absolutely lost his cool. And he bashed this chap up. He got a chair or something. And I won't say nearly killed him, but he did GBH him, grievous bodily harm him. And there's no question that he should have gone to prison. On the other hand, he was a young professional, okay? Or training to be. And I thought, well, if I send him to prison, I've wrecked his life, okay? And if you'd seen this chap, you'd realize that he was so thrilled having this girlfriend, he didn't know that she was a word I couldn't use in this building. But most of us could have told him that. So I said, right, mate. The damages for this case will be £2,000. We all agreed that. I'm going to put the case back for 4 months, and you will come with £2,000, not in your sticky pocket. You'll have paid it to your solicitor, and I want an affirmation from him that you've done it. And people at lunch said, oh, that's an abuse of adjourning sentencing. I said, so what? The Court of Appeal don't get round to cases for 18 months, so I'm all right. And I was, because to my delight, he did come, or the solicitor did come with the 2,000 quid. I gave him a rocket, and I thought, well, that was okay. He can go on with his career. He might be slightly wiser choosing his girlfriends in the future, and et cetera, et cetera. So there are things like that. I've only got 1 more minute. And one very quick one. I think I'm a great believer in arrow prayer. I did have a case, very, very quickly, this one, where the mother was living in Cornwall. She was pretty and a gypsy and incompetent. She'd run up debts. The father was terribly pucker and was very rich in the city. Well, you can't help that, but he was in the city. And he was earning a lot of money with a girlfriend who was even richer than he, and a sweet little boy of 8. And quite unusually, I said, right, I'm going to meet the boy. And I arranged in the High Court, I was a temporary High Court judge, to see this little boy, and we roped off a bit of the restaurant. I had my coffee, he had a little... And he said, I love my mummy and daddy, I want to see both of them, all the time. And I was nearly in tears myself, and I said, look, Tom, I'll call him Tom, look, Tom, I have to tell them this, you know. I'm not a magician, I'm just me. I went back, and I went and said to the parents, and they're very wealthy barristers, one who, by the way, is now in the Court of Appeal, and said, look, something must be done. And I did pray. And the next day, I couldn't believe it. Up they stood, and the father had agreed to pay all the mother's debts, all the mother's debts. The mother had agreed to move from Cornwall to London, and the little boy would therefore see mum and dad. And I was nearly in tears. I thought, gosh, because, I mean, I promise you, it was as near a miracle as I've ever seen. If you'd seen the hatred between the mother and the father, you wouldn't believe it. But anyway, that's that.
Christopher, thank you. Just one. I want you to leave us with one word, as we did with Rory left. The people here gathered here, you know who's here now. What would you say to them? How would you breathe hope into this court part of the criminal justice system? What would you say?
Well, I was very, very moved by both. I mean, I said to my wife, Caroline, help. How am I going to follow those two? I absolutely agree. I think that if every church or Christian community, it needn't be Christian, but let's say for the moment, would, as it were, take on one family or one prisoner or yes, one unit, we could most easily cope. I think of refugees, in fact, in this context, because we've got enough in our village church. We've got enough money, enough wisdom, enough fun, enough food to do it. And if, of course, if one village church took on one ex-prisoner right the way through, we would be, and nobody's sentimental about it, we'd be home and dry.
Thank you. Give a thank you to Christopher Compston.